Few words send a cold chill through the communities of the American Southwest, quite like Skinwalker. For generations, whispers of these shape-shifting beings, rooted in Navajo legend, have haunted the night. Creatures said to wear the skins of animals or even people, to mimic the voices of loved ones, and to prey upon those unlucky enough to cross their path. The Yi-na-lushi, as it's known in the Diné language, represents something far more sinister than campfire stories in Navajo tradition. A witch who has forsaken humanity, who practices the darkest magic, and who walks in forms both human and beast. These beings are said to possess supernatural speed, the ability to read minds, and most terrifyingly, the power to perfectly replicate the voices and appearances of those they've observed. Most dismiss such things as folklore, stories to frighten children on dark desert nights, but some towns have seen enough to never scoff at the warnings again. In the winter of 2019, a series of bizarre and terrifying events forced one ordinary Arizona community to confront the impossible, and what happened over several weeks would lead to an unprecedented mass evacuation still discussed in hushed tones by investigators and locals. Located at the edge of the Navajo Nation, the town of Red Mesa was peaceful, a close-knit place with 400 inhabitants, a gas station, a school, a diner, and sprawling stretches of badlands on all sides. The town sat in a valley surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like fire at sunset, with endless sage plains stretching in every direction. Residents were a mix of Navajo families who'd lived on this land for generations, Anglo ranchers whose families had settled here in the early 1900s, and people who had drifted to Red Mesa seeking a quieter life. Everyone knew everyone, which made it even more disturbing when, just after New Year's, strange incidents began to escalate. Pet disappearances came first, dogs vanishing from fenced yards, cats failing to return home at night. Then came strange footprints discovered in fresh snow and mud. Tracks that started as human feet, but gradually transformed into something more animal-like, with elongated toes and claw marks. Residents began hearing eerie, mocking laughter echoing through the night air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What began as rumors shared in whispered conversations slowly blossomed into collective dread, as more locals reported seeing shadowy figures along fence lines at twilight, strange eyes reflecting in the dark from impossible heights, and hearing voices, sometimes those of deceased family members, sometimes their own voices, calling from the fields outside their homes. The voices were perfect mimicries, down to speech patterns and pet names that only family members would know, making the phenomenon all the more disturbing. Block 1. The shadow spreads. For most of January, the authorities treated every call as a separate, isolated issue. Runaway pets, local teenagers playing pranks, even the possibility of a large predator like a mountain lion causing panic among livestock. Sheriff Dave Caldwell, a lawman of 30 years who'd seen his share of weird events in the remote corners of Arizona, approached each report with professional skepticism. He'd dealt with everything from drug runners using the empty desert as a transit route to confused tourists getting lost in the Badlands, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what was unfolding. Each incident, when examined individually, seemed to have a mundane explanation, but when viewed collectively, a disturbing pattern emerged. Something was systematically terrorizing the entire community, and it was getting bolder with each passing night. By the second week of January, the strange incidents became constant and impossible to dismiss. Local dogs went missing from fenced yards, despite locked gates. Their collars found days later on distant ranch roads, sometimes arranged in neat piles as if deliberately left as messages. Horses and sheep were spooked into breaking through reinforced fences, running for miles across the frozen landscape, returning only at dawn with their eyes wide with terror and their bodies coated in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. Sheriff Caldwell's small department of 3 deputies responded to more than a dozen disturbance calls in just 3 nights. Reports of something large moving on either 2 legs or 4, seen standing in fields just beyond the reach of porch lights, sometimes with luminous eyes that reflected flashlight beams in colors no natural animal should possess. The weak cell service meant many calls were never made, and rumors moved at the speed of fear from porch to porch. It wasn't just animals being affected. People began to see figures on their property at night, pale, elongated shapes standing in silent vigil on the edges of backyards, pressed against windows or crouched near vehicles, vanishing like smoke when approached or when lights were turned on. The townspeople quickly became divided between those who believed this was some natural predator, perhaps coyotes emboldened by winter hunger, and those who recognized something deeper and more sinister, drawing on old family stories passed down through generations about witches, curses, and creatures that thrived when fear was strongest. Some of the Navajo elders quietly dug out protection bundles that had been stored away for decades, sprinkled sacred earth and cornmeal around their doorsteps according to traditional practices, and warned their children and grandchildren not to answer any voice heard after sundown, no matter how familiar it might sound, no matter how desperately it might call for help. By the 3rd week, multiple houses were broken into in ways that made no sense to investigators. Doors were found standing open in the morning, their locks intact but somehow disengaged from the inside. Cabinets were rummaged through, closets opened, but nothing of obvious value was stolen. No electronics, no jewelry, no cash. What was taken made the violations even more disturbing. Photographs removed from frames, hairbrushes with strands of hair still clinging to the bristles, items of worn clothing, even toothbrushes and combs. In one particularly disturbing case, wet, muddy footprints, some clearly human, others unmistakably animal, were found throughout the living room of the Morrison family's ranch house, winding up the stairs to their 9-year-old son's bedroom. The prints were wider and longer than any adult humans, and some appeared to show handprints where no person would naturally crawl, as if something had been moving along the walls. The family barely slept in the days that followed, and neighbors throughout Red Mesa began locking and barricading their doors at sundown. The local elementary school, which served about 70 children from Red Mesa and surrounding ranches, reported a sharp drop in attendance that couldn't be explained by usual winter illnesses. Children, once lively and eager, now huddled together in tight groups at recess, terrified to leave the building or to be separated from adults. Teachers found strange graffiti etched into desks and bathroom walls, crude shapes that looked like stick figures with too many limbs, twisted animals that seemed to be combinations of multiple species, and warnings written in both English and Navajo about the ones who watch and the skin stealers. One night, a group of 5 teenagers who normally hung out at an abandoned barn outside town came racing back in total shock, their clothes torn, faces scratched and bleeding, one girl vomiting in the gas station parking lot out of sheer terror. They claimed to have seen a thing, dark, impossibly tall, with what looked like a deer skull for a face, and long skeletal fingers that made deliberate clicking sounds when drummed against tree bark. The authorities initially dismissed it as panic, until a search of the site turned up scattered belongings, an abandoned car with all doors flung open, and disturbing tracks, some appearing to be made by bare human feet, but impossibly wide, with a long, striding gait, and alongside them prints more like split hooves than human toes. That same night, the Yazzie family, parents in their 40s and 2 teenage daughters, vanished from their home at the edge of town. Concerned friends discovered the house standing open at noon the next day, dinner plates still on the table with food half eaten, the television still playing, and a trail of small, muddy prints leading from inside the house to the road before vanishing. No trace of the Yazzie family was ever found, despite extensive searches by law enforcement, volunteers, and tracking dogs. The case remains officially open and unexplained. But in the weeks and months that followed, those with sharp ears would sometimes swear they heard a woman's voice calling for help on windy nights, a voice that sounded exactly like Mrs. Yazzie, drifting from the canyons to the east, where the land drops away into a maze of red rock and hidden arroyos. Block 2, Town on Edge. News of the incidents began to leak beyond Red Mesa to the outside world. First, through social media posts from frightened residents, then through local news outlets who heard rumors of strange break-ins, missing animals and people, and a community seemingly under siege. Reporters from regional stations arrived with cameras and questions, but they left quickly, often the same day they arrived, finding little but frightened and tight-lipped locals who refused to speak on camera, a sheriff who had no explanations he was willing to share, and stern warnings from tribal elders not to investigate after sunset. The few news segments that aired focused on the missing persons cases and animal disappearances, carefully avoiding any mention of the more outlandish claims. Meanwhile, back in Red Mesa, the sightings grew bolder and more frequent. Several nights in a row, entire blocks of the town lost electrical power simultaneously, plunging homes into absolute darkness at precisely the moment when the sun dropped below the horizon, always just before someone spotted something moving between the houses or caught a glimpse of unblinking eyes glaring from the darkness between pools of light. The power company sent technicians to investigate, but they could find no mechanical cause for the outages. Transformers were functioning normally, lines were intact, and yet the power would simply die for hours at a time in seemingly random sections of town. Some residents began to suspect the outages weren't random at all, that something was deliberately plunging areas into darkness to create hunting grounds. This suspicion seemed confirmed when tracks were found the morning after each outage, clustered around the darkened homes, as if something had been systematically checking each residence while its occupants huddled in the dark. Sheriff Caldwell and his deputies tried their best to keep the peace, organizing nighttime patrols with volunteers from the community and encouraging everyone to keep in touch by ham radio or CB in case the phones went down, which they did with increasing frequency. But the fear that had settled over Red Mesa became suffocating, an almost physical presence. Children refused to sleep alone, and parents took shifts sitting up all night in chairs, positioned where they could watch both doors, weapons and flashlights within easy reach, jumping at every sound outside. The few businesses in town saw their hours shrink as owners refused to stay open past 4 p.m. The diner, once a social hub, now closed at 2 in the afternoon. The gas station operated on reduced hours with armed security, and the school began dismissing students an hour early to ensure everyone could reach home before sunset. The townsfolk began to call the entity by its oldest and most feared name, Yi Naldlushi. Skinwalker, the witch who walks on all fours and sometimes on two, who wears the skins of animals and sometimes people, and who mimics voices to lure the weak and the lost into the wilds. Every day brought new reports, and now the sightings weren't just from the outlying farmsteads, but from right within the town limits. One elderly Navajo elder named George Benally, who'd lived in Red Mesa for 82 years and was known for his level-headed nature, told anyone who would listen how he'd seen 2 tall figures, stick-thin and moving with an unsettling grace, walking side by side down the road past the church at 3 in the morning, pausing to look at the building for several minutes before vanishing into thin air as dawn approached. If George said he'd seen something, people believed him. The horror reached a new level when a group of 6 teenagers vanished after a bonfire gathering outside town. They'd driven out to a popular spot near an old windmill, ignoring warnings from their parents. The next morning, 4 of the kids stumbled back into town, bloodied and delirious, their clothes torn and their bodies covered in scratches. They were muttering about running through the dark while the copy thing hunted them, about seeing their own faces looking back at them from the darkness, about hearing their names called in their own voices. When law enforcement arrived at the site, they found the car and belongings still there. The fire burned down to ashes, but 17-year-old Sarah Martinez was missing. Her shoes were found by the tree line, placed neatly side by side, and her tracks led into the brush before stopping abruptly beside other tracks that looked like split hooves of a deer, but far too large. Despite searching with tracking dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers for days, no sign of Sarah was ever found. Inside homes throughout Red Mesa, the paranormal activity became even more disturbing. Multiple residents described hearing their own voices calling from outside their houses, sometimes having full conversations with themselves that they could hear but weren't participating in. Others woke to find family photographs missing from walls, only to discover them later arranged in disturbing patterns on kitchen floors or propped up facing windows as if something had been studying the images. Old clothing was found laid out in perfectly arranged circles in living rooms. Doors stood open despite being locked the night before, and muddy prints, both hand-shaped and paw-shaped, appeared across floors, up walls, and even across ceilings, sometimes trailing to bedrooms where children slept. Panic began to turn into despair. One elderly man named Edward So barricaded himself in his bedroom for 3 days straight, refusing to let anyone approach after claiming he'd heard the thing breathing just outside his door, heard it opening and closing each cabinet in his kitchen quietly and methodically, as if hunting for something or simply enjoying the violation of his space. Block 3, the mass evacuation. Calls for outside help escalated from local law enforcement to tribal authorities and finally to the state level. But nobody seemed to have answers or solutions. The phenomenon didn't fit into any category that modern authorities knew how to handle. It wasn't a criminal matter, wildlife issue, or natural disaster. Scientists were eventually called in to examine tracks and analyze physical evidence, but all they found were conflicting impressions, odd chemical residues that didn't match any known biological substances, and a community slowly consuming itself with worry and fear. Psychologists suggested mass hysteria, but that didn't explain the physical evidence, the tracks, the missing people, the damaged property. As the days grew shorter and the cold of the high desert winter deepened, Red Mesa felt as if it teetered on the edge of complete collapse. The turning point that would force the evacuation came during a particularly terrifying night when the public power grid failed for several hours across the entire town. It was a new moon, meaning the sky was pitch black with no moonlight, and the night belonged entirely to the shadows. That night, several independent witnesses saw 3 or 4 figures, tall, impossibly lanky, with gaits that switched between 2-legged and 4-legged movement, walking down the town's main street just after midnight. The figures moved with purpose, stopping at every house, crouching at doors and windows, appearing to sniff at thresholds and scratch at frames, leaving behind sticky, wet prints and tufts of coarse hair that laboratory testing would later identify as indeterminate mammalian origin. At least 2 households reported family members going into trance-like states that night, leaving their beds while apparently still asleep and attempting to walk toward the front door, only to be stopped by panicked relatives who later claimed the sleepwalkers had been whispering in voices that weren't their own, speaking in languages the family members didn't know. A small fire mysteriously broke out in the school gymnasium around 2 a.m., believed to be arson, after investigators found signs of accelerant use. A local boy named Tommy Begay later tearfully confessed to Sheriff Caldwell that he'd set it, saying through sobs that he just wanted the thing that wore his dad's face to stay away from the classrooms. Tommy's father had died 3 years earlier in a car accident, making his claim all the more disturbing. The boy was clearly traumatized, not malicious, and no charges were filed. But the incident added to the town's collective terror. By dawn the next day, several homes had been found completely abandoned, their curtains billowing in the icy morning wind. beds unmade with impressions still in the sheets, food half-cooked on stoves that had been left on all night. Personal vehicles were gone from driveways, suggesting families had fled in the middle of the night without telling anyone. Frantic town meetings that day devolved into shouting matches. Rumors swirled of entire families driving out under cover of darkness, never to return. Arguments broke out between those insisting the sheriff needed to organize an official evacuation and those who refused to leave their homes, some out of stubborn disbelief, others because they had nowhere else to go, and a few elderly Navajo residents who insisted that fleeing would only make the entities stronger. The final tipping point was reached when a group of 7 armed volunteers patrolling the edge of town in the pre-dawn hours encountered something that would leave half of them traumatized for years. At approximately 4:30 a.m., while the patrol was checking the perimeter near the old cemetery, their radios all erupted in static simultaneously, and something huge and moving with impossible speed, rushed them from between 2 abandoned houses. Dogs that had been with the patrol suddenly fell dead silent, and several simply dropped to the ground and refused to move. The men described being paralyzed with fear so intense it felt like a physical force. They saw a figure, impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, running on all fours with a speed that blurred its outline, yet somehow rising to stand on 2 legs and turn to look at them when challenged. The thing's face seemed to shift and change between animal and human features, flickering as if it wore many masks at once. Most terrifying was its voice, sometimes a child's high-pitched tone, sometimes a gravelly ancient voice, and sometimes, most horrifyingly, it used the exact voice of one of the patrol members, speaking that man's name in his own voice, asking himself why he was so afraid. At least 3 of the volunteers quit on the spot, refusing to ever set foot in Red Mesa again, and one man suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological break, needing to be physically restrained and sedated by paramedics. That day, with the town in chaos, the evacuation was officially announced by joint decision of county emergency services, tribal authorities, and the sheriff's department. Under orders from multiple agencies, residents were told to pack essentials, lock their homes, and report to the high school gym by sunset. Buses had been arranged for those without vehicles, and the National Guard had been called in to provide security. The evacuation took place over 2 days. Buses and personal vehicles formed long caravans heading out of town, headlights illuminating a procession of ashen, haunted faces leaving their homes behind. Some residents refused evacuation to the end, including a handful of traditional elders who performed protection rituals and told volunteers to let the spirits claim what belongs to the land. The rest, about 90% of the town, fled east towards safer towns where emergency housing had been arranged. National Guard units watched from the outskirts as Red Mesa emptied, and more than one guardsman later reported feeling intensely watched from the empty buildings, though nothing was seen on thermal imaging or night vision equipment. Conclusion: Red Mesa stands today as a modern ghost town, its houses silent and slowly being reclaimed by the desert, its streets covered in drifting sand and tumbleweeds, its windows dark and staring like hollow eyes. The town has become a destination for urban explorers and paranormal investigators, though tribal police and county sheriff regularly patrol to prevent trespassing. Occasional investigators still sneak in beyond the warning signs, drawn by legends of the mass evacuation. Some never emerge, their vehicles found abandoned on access roads, their last cell phone signals abruptly stopped. But the people who survived the terror of Red Mesa know better than to ever return. They never speak the name Skinwalker after dark, refuse to discuss what happened in detail, and many have moved far from the Southwest entirely. Sheriff Dave Caldwell retired from law enforcement 6 months after the evacuation, his hair having gone completely white, looking 20 years older than he had at the crisis's beginning. He moved to Oregon to live near his daughter, seeking the green forests as far from the high desert as he could manage. He remains haunted by memories, shadows moving where there shouldn't be shadows, the perfect mimicry of his dead wife's voice calling from empty fields, the tracks that shouldn't exist but that he documented with his own hands. In rare, anonymous interviews, Caldwell has said that whatever was in Red Mesa wasn't a single entity, but multiple beings working in coordination, and that they're still there, waiting in the abandoned buildings for the next person foolish enough to return after dark. The mass evacuation of Red Mesa remains one of the most unusual incidents in modern American history. A rare event where local, state, tribal, and federal authorities all tacitly agreed that there was something present that could not be simply explained or rationalized using conventional understanding. While official reports carefully avoid any mention of supernatural causes, the unspoken agreement among those who were there is that Red Mesa fell victim to something ancient and malevolent. The case has been analyzed by anthropologists, paranormal researchers, and folklorists, all offering different theories, but no theory adequately explains all the evidence, the physical tracks, the recorded voices, the missing people, and the collective testimony of hundreds of witnesses. To this day, whenever a new moon falls and the wind rises across the high desert, Navajo elders throughout the Southwest renew their protection circles around their homes, burn sacred herbs, and warn their children again as their ancestors warned them. Whatever calls you from the shadows, no matter how sweet or familiar the voice, do not answer, do not follow, and above all, do not speak its name, for to name something is to acknowledge its power. The spirits that walk between forms remain in the lonely places, and Red Mesa stands as a monument to what happens when a community encounters something that science cannot explain. The town waits in the desert silence, and on certain nights, those who dare approach report seeing lights moving through abandoned buildings and hearing voices carried on the wind. Voices calling out names, voices that sound exactly like friends and family, voices that promise safety if you would just come closer. But the smart ones, the ones who remember, know better than to listen. They drive on past, windows up and doors locked, never stopping until the abandoned town is miles behind them and the sun is safely above the horizon.